Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com, and today I'm here again with Roz Morris. Hi Roz.
Hi Joanna.
Welcome back on the show. So just a little introduction if you've missed one of the many episodes Roz has been on before. Roz is a best-selling author as a ghostwriter and now an award-nominated author with her own literary novels, My Memories of a Future Life and Lifeform Three. She writes writing craft books for authors under the Nail Your Novel brand, and her latest book, and the one we're talking about today, is Not Quite Lost, Travels Without a Sense of Direction, which is fantastic, and I've read it myself, which I can't say that with all my guests. But I think I've actually read all your books, Roz. That must be a record.
Well, maybe I don't have very many.
But no, that's fantastic. So because you've been on the show before, we're going to suggest people listen to previous episodes for your history, and we're going to get straight into it and start with definitions. So let's start with, what is the difference between a memoir and a biography?
Well, biographies tend to be written about other people, not by the person who is actually being featured. But the difference between a memoir and an autobiography, obviously you write your own, or someone will ghost it for you, but then that's a whole different world. But generally an autobiography tends to be an entire life. So it's usually written by somebody who's a very prominent, so famous that you just know their name, and just their name would get you interested, really. The whole thing about them is interesting. But a memoir is much more focused. So one person might have many memoirs in them, according to different phases of their lives, different challenges they've faced. People would be interested in them for different things. And another interesting thing about memoir is it often dovetails with other genres. So you might have, there's quite a genre of medical and recovery kinds of stories. So someone might write a memoir about overcoming cancer, or being with a friend in the sort of their final years or something like that, and it's just a few years, it's just a short period, and the arc is defined by this experience. Other kinds of memoirs are travel, and particular adventures in, say, unusual places, or going around Ireland with a fridge, or some of them might be really tiny, appear to be really tiny territories, like Ian Sinclair, who did a book about walking around the M25. They can be big or small, but they tend to be very contained. And I suppose another quite prominent genre is disastrous businesses.
Yeah.
So, where you've got a story arc, and the story and the subject is probably going to invite people in, it might be a good idea to consider making it a memoir.
Wow, so much there, and we're going to come back to all these in more detail, but let's come to you now. So why did you decide to write a memoir now at this point, and maybe dovetail in there a bit about what you're writing for your literary stuff right now? And because it's interesting, because you take, obviously your books are literary, so they take longer to write, and this has kind of appeared in the middle of what of writing. So talk about your, why now?
Well, it's all sort of happened quite naturally and by accident, with no particular plan. Basically, I have a book that, and I've got it right here.
Oh, show us.
It's a leather-bound diary. It's an old visitor's book. I don't know if you can see it there. It's got visitors on it. It's leather. It's really tatty. I won't try and open it. It's got gold edging. It's beautiful. And that always travelled in my suitcase. Whenever Dave, my husband, and I went anywhere, that book was in the bag, and we'd unpack it on the first night, and he didn't write in it, I did, but I just liked it as a special book I would use to write in whenever I was a visitor's book. And so we were on holiday last November. We just went off to stay in a sweet little folly that it overlooked a river in Nottinghamshire, and I opened the book and there were some stories in there of things that had happened to us. Like there's a time when the car window got stuck down, or there was a strange guy that we met who showed us around the sights of Glastonbury and drove us through the hills and said, look at that hill, it's the goddess, and things like that. And I'd written all these things down. So first night we got wine and I said, oh, there's this and this and this. And Dave said, you should put those in a book. And I said, yes, they'll go in a novel sometime, because, I've got heaps of notebooks of things, and I sort of dip into them and find things that will be useful for my fiction. But he said, no, I mean write them as a kind of Bill Bryson sort of journal. And I said, don't be ridiculous. I'm not Bill Bryson. Nobody will take any notice of a little book like that by me. But he thought it was a really good idea. He kept on at me all through the week. And I actually started to like the idea because I'd so enjoyed writing them for myself. And this is how all our creative work starts anyway, isn't it? We do something that just sort of pleases us. We can lose hours in it. It feels rewarding to do, and we've then sort of discovered how to get a bit better at it and so on. And I'd got these pieces that I'd written because I wanted to keep them and I wanted to make something out of them. So eventually we got back and I thought, all right, well, I will see if I can make a proper book out of it. And I also tried to get various blunt speaking writer friends to talk me out of it and said, look, this could be very self-indulgent. And they said, no, do it. We think it sounds like a really good idea. So I thought, all right, so I should take this seriously. So I started looking at it and I thought, well, I'll look at the pieces that would be the kinds of things that I would tell other people, that might be interesting anecdotes. And then I thought, well, I'll sort of look a bit deeper and see if there are themes I can use to pull it together. And gradually these pieces kind of emerged. It was like planets forming from little bits of asteroid being attracted to a central idea. And in some ways I felt like it was a bit like an album of songs. They weren't necessarily, some of them are stories and some of them are more kind of musings about being in a place. There was one piece that I wrote which was about the first time we had sat-nav, because it seemed wondrous, because we were driving in our car and a voice would tell us where to go and it could see us, and it had a little display that said 8 satellites are watching you. And I thought, but that is fantastic. And so I thought, right, I have to see if I can write something that will get other people as excited about that as I was. And that was part of the kind of travel experience that I enjoy. It's little surprising things about life and odd things that I just didn't want to disappear. And that was the book.
Yeah, but I'm still interested in how it fits into what you're currently writing as a novelist, because I find, it's fiction and non-fiction are kind of slightly different. But with memoir, you are bringing in things that I would expect normally to appear in fiction, and like you said, fictionalized in some way. So how did you manage the creative process working on 2 books? And did you find any sort of cross-contamination between the 2 during the process?
Well, interestingly, I found when I went back over this diary, I found the seeds of various important things that I've put in my fiction. And I hadn't realized that's where they came from. That these experiences had gone into my subconscious somewhere, or maybe the process of writing about them and studying them a bit more meant they became things I then wanted to use in my fiction. For instance, there's a piece about an old house, a mansion in Devon, that now it's mostly overgrown gardens and mysterious steps in the grass, and there's a chunk of tower covered in ivy, and that's about all there is left. And I remember reading about this and discovering it and sort of visiting what I could of it and thinking, this is great. Well, imagine what it was like when it was actually here. And that became the environment of Lifeform 3, which is set in a future when all the countryside has disappeared except for one estate that used to be a country house like Downton Abbey, and there are little pieces of the house that remain hidden in the woods, and you just find a little corner of stone or a chunk of brick or a fireplace or something. And that idea, I realised, came from my fascination with this house that I discovered, and I visited what I could of it. So there are ways in which these sort of fascinations stay with us and then creep out again as a place we can inhabit or use. And obviously, when you're travelling about or anywhere in life, actually, you might come across people who are going to be posting themselves into your characters. But I think characters are a bit different because I've never made a fictional character directly from someone I've met. I've always done a lot of work and added things to them. So it's more places and environments and sort of maybe chance happenings that I find tend to go into the fiction. And they probably also tend to correspond to just what I'm interested in. I love ideas of haunting, but in non-paranormal ways. So outlines of old buildings, people seeing places as powerful, but in maybe a psychological way rather than a paranormal way. That's why I called it Not Quite Lost in a way. I mean, the title Not Quite Lost came, first of all, as a wry joke on the fact that I have no sense of direction, and that these were little tales. So they were just little, there's like columns. You just go about and find one interesting thing and then another interesting thing. But also underneath that was a kind of resonance, an idea of things passing and getting hidden and buried under time. So that was, I suppose what I did in this book was I just took my general outlook, the filter that makes fiction, and I put the raw material in the book instead.
No, I think that's really interesting. And I think one of the biggest issues with memoir is what to leave out. And it seems to me, I've read quite a lot of memoir, a lot of travel memoir, and I've read a few at the same time as I was looking at yours, and that was really interesting to see, what people put in and what people don't put in. So, for example, you mentioned yours are vignettes over like 25 years or something, the amount of time, and you don't have a bridging thing between each vignette. It's just like this happened and then another time this happened. So you've left out the rest of your life and included these segments of theme that fit around your theme. So when, talking to people listening who want to write their memoir, how do you know what to leave out?
It's a very good question. And the original draft of this was bigger, and then there were things I found that were repeating, and I thought, I don't need to repeat these things. I'll gather together. There's one piece which is called Nobody Comes Here in November, and it's about just being in places out of season, and they're not necessarily friendly environments for tourists anymore, but if you come at a different time of year, they are. And those took place over several years, actually, and in different places. So I just put them together and thought, right, there's where I deal with that, and then we're not going to visit that again. With a memoir, which might be a story, so if, say, you've got a recovery from something, or coming to terms with something, you'll probably have certain points in one arc that you will identify. So beginning, middle, and end, really, the structure that we put on fictional stories is very useful for writing memoir, and it helps to actually use quite a lot of the fictional techniques. So when I've worked with people who've written memoir, what I've often found is if they identify where these high points are, the various structure points and plot points, and then figure out how they're going to make everything else serve those points and serve that arc and help the reader understand, it's always much easier for them to then see what they can leave out. And also you have to be willing to reorder events, because emphasis is very important with memoir. It's what an event means, and in fact you could use an event in a number of different ways, just as you could in a work of fiction. You could use it to illustrate someone's character at the beginning. You could use it as a kind of bit of light relief just after something that's been quite a negative note. You could use it even as a climax. So you need to think of ways that you'll use the raw material you've got, and you often end up leaving a lot out. You often have a lot of darlings. But what I will say to people is that with the internet and with the need to have extra materials, all the stuff you take out can be like DVD extras. Or little teaser pieces that you can use while getting people involved in the book and seeing if they want to buy it. But yes, you will have a huge wealth of material, and you need to find ways to massage it and make the best use of it, and less is usually more.
And do you obviously you have your book there, the visitor's book, and
do you want to look at it again?
Yes, show us again. Lovely, beautiful, and that's great because it kind of gives you your theme. I mean, it just gave you it. I think a lot of people would come to Memoir in a more of a different way. So theme for you was obvious. What tips do you have for people if they need to find their theme in a mass of material? Like behind me, I've got a ton of journals. How would I know how to find a theme in there? Or is that something that you think comes to all memoir writers?
I think it does jump out quite obviously if you, well, actually, and I do know people who have started writing a memoir, but not realised that it's best to be focused on one particular story. So it's like, this is the story of how I did this. And if you think of it in those terms, then it becomes quite obvious what you'll put in and what you'll leave out for perhaps another book entirely. In your case, for instance, you've got several sort of episodes to the big memoirs of Joanna altogether would probably be the publishing journey. Before that, I know you've said in the past that you've run businesses that didn't go terribly well, so you could have the unfortunate business experiences memoirs, and you could have a number of things. So if you think of your life in terms of adventures, then that's a way to identify what should go in and what could be left for another kind of book.
And you mentioned there reordering and also some of the fiction techniques. So how much is absolute truth and how much is storyfied or narrative non-fiction, which some people really hate the idea? You know, when is it fiction and when is it memoir? Is there a line there?
Well, I think it has to be self-imposed. There are probably a lot of people who get away with writing things as memoirs and they've made stuff up. But I decided that my own rule, because I do write fiction as well, I thought my own rule had to be, it's true. Everything's true. What I have changed is people so that they're not recognisable, unless I've got their permission to put them in. But otherwise, the people are hopefully not identifiable. But the events are all true because this was the point of the exercise. I had to make it things that I could get other people interested in. And part of that would be the way I handled the material. So that often came down actually to telling a joke against myself about, maybe how useless I've been about foreign languages. There's one piece called Pardon Our French, which is just about the kind of pickles that both Dave and I got into, because although we are really good at English, put us in a foreign country where we have to use some other language and we are hopeless, we are helpless. And I found this incredibly funny because I thought that it just illustrated how you can take a fish out of water and it is completely useless. So all that, though, it was all truth. What I had to do was find a thing to make out of it. And again, there were quite a few pieces that I tried and I couldn't find the way to make them work. So I just discreetly withdrew them and they have gone back in the book. Maybe they'll end up in fiction.
Yeah. So is the guideline is it should be true, like 90% truth in order to stay memoir, like it just seems like some people do. Well, your description of, say, the tumble down building and adding, if there wasn't any ivy on it, it would be nice if there was some ivy on it, because that that's what people expect from a tower. Would you have embellished the ivy or some other stuff like that to kind of make it more atmospheric or other things like that?
I'm trying to think if I did do things like that, that's how I genuinely did have ivy on it, and I've got the pictures to prove it.
I believe you.
It was like a big square of ivy. It was all together ivy beard. It was amazing. But I think what I did was I tried to go back to the truth as much as possible, but I might have had to remind myself of things. So I went and looked at a lot of current pictures and thought, oh, yes, I do remember there's a little lane that went up there and it had this feel to it. I think you have to do a lot of reminding. But it was just my own personal boundaries. I had to make sure absolutely everything was true and real, and that when I was describing people, even though they weren't going to be recognizable, I was being true to the person in another way. Because what I find with fiction is, because I can make up absolutely anything I like, then that is a completely different department.
Coming to people then, because this is, I think, one of the biggest issues of memoir is many people write about a painful family experience, for example. And of course, you've mentioned Dave, and he's in the book, your husband, Dave. But you also have some stuff about your family, which I didn't know, an estranged family situation and your brother. And so there's obviously sensitive things that must have come up for you, or maybe you've dealt with that. But in reading it, it's kind of like, oh, it's a little glimpse into something that's more intimate than an ivy-covered tower, for example. So first of all, from your perspective, how difficult is it to deal with personal things out loud in a memoir?
It is quite difficult. When I first had the idea that I must write that piece, I was kind of 50% collywobbles and 50% eager to do it, because I thought, can I write something that will deal with this and in a way that will be interesting, of any interest at all to other people, for a start, and that also will be fair to everybody involved. And it's not that revealing, actually. It doesn't dig any dirt. But it was writing about a time and a situation that was very difficult. So I had to work very hard on that piece and find a way to do justice to it and make it something that stood up in its own right as well. It is hard, but I was reading a lot of personal essays at the time, and I love that as a form. I love the way someone can really kind of open themselves up to the page. They will write about something like, say, a person they had a relationship with, or just one conversation they had. And in that, you feel you've seen them in an incredibly honest place. And I love that. And once I got the idea, well, I must just try to do that with this piece. Forget about anyone who might read it. Do justice to the material first, and try and create something that does communicate something that seems to like it would be sort of give to other people. And that's what I did. But I often find with my fiction that in order to write that with truth, I have to sort of think what characters might feel in sort of quite deep and nasty recesses of yourself. And I know you've talked about this, about how you write something and you find, oh, I'm actually delving into some stuff here. People don't necessarily have to think it's me, but I know I'm drawing on something that I understand and maybe have never talked about out loud. So it's a similar sort of thing, but I think that's something that writers do. We plumb ourselves.
No, I think you're right, and I don't think you've done this, but because you're a very wise writer. But I do know that people who might not have as much experience as you, whose first book might be a memoir, I think there is a danger of therapy, a memoir as therapy. So how do people know where that line is between, as you said, sharing something of truth that will help others versus writing for therapy that might be better left in a journal?
Oh, that is so difficult. And it's probably better if you feel there's something that you've just got to discharge, write it as therapy, write with the doors closed, and then let it rest and come out and think, okay, how could this accommodate readers, because often when you write as therapy, people actually write in a big tunnel, and they don't think of how they're coming across and how they're building up other people's understanding of a situation. So they might sort of launch in and they know everything, but the reader doesn't. So they've got to think of how to bring people in, and it takes a lot of practice. And the best thing to do is to read other books that have done that successfully, so you can then spot how they've used the material, how they've brought the reader in, how they've let the reader understand how they felt and kept the reader on their side. Even when they've done dreadful things. Often these books involve confessions of things that people are actually quite disturbed by, or even ashamed by, or they wish they could have done better, all those kinds of things. It is possible to make a memoir out of that material, but it takes a lot of work. And the splurge draft, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, but just the gush where you just get it out is just one phase. And some people don't move beyond that, and that's fine, because therapy is something that is useful. And writing as sort of self-understanding is also useful. But if you're writing it to share with a book buying audience, that's when you have to start really thinking about how to meet that audience.
Yeah, it's a good point. And yeah, out of my lots and lots of journals, about 3 of them were when I got divorced, my sort of personal period in my life. And yeah, the woman who wrote those journals, did therapy through writing, and I don't think they're ever worth publishing, but it's interesting how sometimes that isn't, it doesn't need to, not everything needs to go in a book. At least in an obvious way. And yes, to everyone listening, we're absolutely saying writing as therapy is brilliant. It just doesn't mean it has to be published in some form. Okay, so that's very cool. So I want to ask about staying on the final part of people and truth. Many people worry about getting sued by someone who they might have used in a memoir, because of course subjective truth is very different depending on which side of the coin you might have been on. So do you have any tips for people if they're worried about any legal ramifications and they don't want to ask permission? So they don't want to ask the person's permission, and they, say it is a divorce and they want to write something that, has that other person in. Do you have any tips for dealing with that?
Well, try and make them completely unrecognizable. And that might be extremely difficult if it's a divorce, because divorces involve big networks of people. Yeah. And everyone knows who they were. And anyone could come out of the woodwork and say, oh, you wrote about me here. And it's really, really difficult. Usually, if a book's being published by a mainstream publisher, and they'll have chosen to take on some of the legal risk, and they'll have a lawyer look through it and so on, and they'll have editors who are used to dealing with this kind of material. As indies, it's a bit more difficult. You might have to get a lawyer to look over it, and that might be money well spent. It all depends on how on what your story is, really. If the story is focusing a lot more on you and what you did and what you kind of learned and how you changed, you might not have to worry about it so much, because really the joke's on you. You probably won't be using other people, painting other people in a bad light. But again, you should be quite careful. I've again worked with quite a few people who've written memoirs, and they've put people together to make a character who represents several, and sometimes that's worked. You just have to be careful. There was a situation in Not Quite Lost where I contacted some people and said, do you mind? And some of them said, oh yeah, and that's absolutely fine. I said, well, you can look at it if you want. They said, no, it was great. And those are the people in the dance advert. The cryonicists, I contacted them, and they were sort of quite worried. So I sent them the piece, and they wrote back and said, oh, this is a bit iffy. I thought, yep, I'm happy to change anything that is not sort of factually correct, so that's fine. But you always have to be careful about things like libel. And libel is bringing somebody into disrepute. And even if you can prove they were an absolute rotter, it is still quite a headache. So you have to be careful. And my final word on this is that some people will find themselves in your book, even if you were never anywhere near them. I read an essay by Caroline Leavitt, who was recently on my series, The Undercover Soundtrack, and she said she got sued over a couple of her novels, actually. There were people, and these were novels, they were fiction. A couple of people wrote to her publisher and said, "You've used my situation and put me in the book." And she said, "But I can prove I've never heard of you." And unfortunately, it did sort of get to the stage where lawyers were being talked to. So bear in mind that that's the environment you publish into, so you do have to be extremely careful.
Yes, so basically we're not lawyers, and disclaimer, but be careful what you're writing and consider how it might affect other people. And again, I think that's where the therapy issue bleeds a little bit, because if you are so hurt by something, and I'm saying this because whenever I meet someone who's writing a memoir, they're always saying something about some very, very volatile situation that sounds like they need therapy rather than to write a book to entertain other people. So that's kind of why I bring it up, because that does seem quite a common reason. Like anger is a very big reason to write memoir.
Yeah, writing in a state of hurt, writing in a state of injustice, any of this, there might be another side of the story, but you have your right to tell your story. You have your right to figure out your feelings and to use whatever you need to do that. And sometimes it might be better to use it for a novel instead.
Yes, that's what I think. Okay, so I do want to ask you mentioned the dance a commercial chapter, which is really interesting. I didn't find it so interesting for the dancing as your comments on imposter syndrome, because you're just like, yeah, I'm not a professional dancer and I'm ending up in this with all these professional people. And you talked about, feeling like an imposter, fear of being exposed as a fraud. And I thought, this actually, when I was thinking, well, part of me has always wanted to write memoir, and then I think, oh no, I'm not famous. I'm no, how could I write a memoir? So how did you must have felt that too, right? Like you said, I'm not Bill Bryson, so how can I write something like this? So how did you get over that in order to tackle that imposter syndrome?
Well, it's funny. I think there are two departments to my kind of writer brain, and maybe this is how everybody's imposter syndrome works. There's at the beginning of this book, for instance, I was thinking, I can't write that. Don't be silly. People like me that don't write books like that, or people don't read books like that by people like me. And then enough people said, of course you could write something like that. I'd read it, sort of thing. But then still, that's just a small group of friends. But then there's kind of another part, as a sort of more confident part of me, I think. This is only how I work, but maybe other people do too. But I'd find that if I was reading a book like that, I think, I'd enjoy writing this kind of thing. And actually, I think I might be all right at it. And then I'd find, you kind of read a few pieces, a few columns by someone who is writing the same kind of thing. And you think, oh yeah, I can just imagine how my piece on such and such would go. And it's like you find if you have a go, you might be able to hit a groove. And that's what I found with Not Quite Lost. I find it's a bit different with my novels, because what tends to happen with my novels is I get an idea and then the hard work starts and I think, oh, what have I bitten off? Really, I mean, because I tend to do different things each time, it was very easy if I was ghostwriting a series, because it would just be, oh yeah, okay, I know exactly where I am. It's a kind of familiar environment, familiar people and everything. But with each novel, it's just a big sort of starting block to get over. And I would think, I don't know if I can do this. And it was exactly what I found I was feeling when I did the dance advert. I thought, as I thought back over my experiences doing that, I thought, this is what I'm always like. This is me realizing I always feel like an imposter when I start something that I'm sort of a bit that makes me a bit worried that I don't know if I can pull off. And then I find as I get into it and that I've sort of fought a few fires, and it's still all right. It's still going to just about be workable. I just kind of find my feet, and certainly with writing, I can trust the process. The process has got me through my books, and so when it's going badly, I just think, right, the process will get me through today, and tomorrow, something will have been figured out. And then by the time I'm halfway through, I think, okay, I have got to grips with this, and more problems are just dropping on me, but that's all right because I've already got this number that I've sorted out in the past. And so that's it. But I think with each book I feel imposter syndrome before I've got to a certain stage where I'm feeling comfortable in it. And I probably always will feel like that.
Yeah, and perhaps, if you stop feeling that, then maybe you're not writing on the edge of what you should be writing. If you're too comfortable, then it probably will be boring for the reader.
Boring for the reader, and it'll bore you as well, which of course the reader will know. But yes, and the thing that keeps you interested is sometimes that little whiff of danger. Can I get away with this?
Yeah, exactly. And I think I was talking to another interviewee, Michael Ridpath, about when do you know a series is finished? And kind of we were both saying, well, it's when you don't want to write it anymore because you've got that you can't get that feeling anymore. You're like, I don't want to spend my time writing another book like this. So I think this is really interesting. Okay, so let's just come on to marketing, because you have the Nail Your Novel series, which is books for writers, and you've been on the show talking about that before. Very clear target market, authors, writers, and so it's easy enough to market that. You've got a blog, you market, you talk to writers, you do events, etc. Then you've got your fiction, your literary fiction, which everyone knows is difficult to market.
Oh, yes.
So we're not talking about that. But with this memoir, how are you doing marketing for a memoir, which, I mean, you're not going to have a whole series of travel memoirs, I don't expect.
No, I don't think I travel enough.
No, exactly. Really. So this is kind of a standalone non-fiction in a new niche that you don't have any, So anyway, so how are you marketing this book?
Well, what I did was I looked up, I did a lot of research on Amazon. I looked up comparison titles. I sort of figured out what their categories were, tried to find outlets that were interested in covering that kind of book. It's a much easier kind of book to market, actually, than any of my fiction. I just kind of throw my hands up with my fiction thing. I just don't know what to do about it beyond a few kind of places. But with this, I just found I was getting more and more ideas. So travel magazines, walking magazines, anything to do with Britain. I found a website called Anglophilia, which just loves anything English, and that is quite an English book. So, I pitched them. They were really happy. I just found places that had covered books like this and said, I've got this coming out. It also helped that I did something I've never done before, which was I had a 2-month lead in before the publication date. It doesn't actually officially publish until the 2nd of October, but I started my marketing on the 1st of August. And I think you'd be proud of me.
Yeah, that's amazing. I never do that.
Usually I just push the book out of the nest and it's there already. But I found out from previous books actually that some of the magazines, the mainstream magazines, like a couple of months to figure out what they want to cover and get their books pages all sorted out well before the publication date. So I allowed myself enough time to actually have a good run up at those magazines, and that meant I had time to try quite a lot of them, do more in-depth research, and just target my marketing a bit more intelligently than I have in the past. But it is a title that is more easy to market than anything else I've written.
How interesting. Yeah, I guess because it is travel, like British travel memoir.
Yeah.
It does have quite an interesting niche. And did you, with your marketing hat on, I know that the writer and the marketer have to be different, but as you were writing, I can't remember, did you kind of scatter mentions of some of your novels within it?
What I did was I put a piece at the end called Westward, which is, first of all, it's all the places in case people want to visit them and where they can find them. But it's also how some of those places were prequels for what eventually ended up in my novels. Because by the time I'd finished massaging the pieces so that they would make proper pieces for a book like this. I kind of learned quite a lot about the way I thought and the way ideas worked on me. And so I included a few paragraphs about how some of those travels had ended up in my novels, and also how there are some destinations that are going into Everest, which is the novel I'm working on at the moment. And so I hoped that people who've enjoyed my writing style, for those who also like fiction, might also find their way to my fiction.
No, I think that's right. And because, as you say, your literary fiction is kind of standalone as well. So, people might just try that, I guess. And on the publication of it, I remember a while ago you were looking into doing a special print edition that was similar to your visitor's book. What did you end up doing around the physical publication?
Well, I did go to Clay's and ask them about leather-bound volumes, and I had a lovely meeting. I was shown all sorts of really lovely things, but the cost was prohibitive. I could maybe, if the sales of the original go really well, I could do something like a Kickstarter and try and get funding for a different version, a limited edition. I could possibly do that, but I figured I didn't have the time to do a proper campaign for that. And I know people who've done Kickstarters. You can't do any of this just by slapping a few things on a website and hoping it will work. You've really got to look at them properly. Any publisher would have people whose dedicated job was all this stuff, all the marketing, any special editions, anything like that. They all have to be done properly. And I didn't want to do a shoddy job. So I shelved that, and I know what it would cost, so I know how I could do it. But what I did in the end was I just did my usual ebook version. I've got a lovely paperback. In fact, it's here. There's the front, and there's the back.
Lovely.
And I've got that so far, and I'll just see how those go.
No, that's very cool. And then I guess I've got to ask you, so have you got the taste for Memoir? Are you going to do some more?
Dave would love me to do more. he keeps seeing other memoirs and saying, well, you could do one like that. And I think he suddenly thinks I might just hit a rich seam like Bill Bryson. And I point out to him that it's about 20 years worth that went in that book, so he's going to have to do an awful lot of adventuring. And I don't know. I did find myself writing another piece that I don't know if there will be another book yet, because I will need a lot of other pieces to go with it. But I do enjoy that kind of writing. I've sort of found a new groove that I just find rewarding. I like doing it. I probably won't stop writing like this, and maybe in a few years' time there'll be another. I don't know. I don't have specific plans, but I can see that it could get a bit wearing. That friends and family will say, "Oh, we don't want another adventure."
And what about with your non-fiction books? Because obviously you have Nail Your Novel and edits and lots of different books for authors. What about Nail Your Memoir?
Well, yeah, that's an idea. And Nail Your Non-Fiction was something I had thought of doing because I've not only written the Nail Your Novel books, but I've worked on a lot of non-fiction. And when I was running a publishing imprint, it was mainly non-fiction that we did. So I've seen a lot of non-fiction books through from little germ of an idea to the finished book being printed on a ship on its way from China, all that stuff. So I mean, it could be something I do, but I find, like I was saying with the leather-bound version, to do anything like this, you actually have to have proper time. There's so many things that we could do. We've got to decide what we're going to spend our time on. And at the moment, the thing I've really got to try and nail is my third novel, because it really matters to me to get that out. So I'm hoping that will be the next thing, unless I get some big, amazing project I suddenly get pulled into and think, well, I can't pass that up. But yes, we've only got finite amount of time and energy. That's the main problem.
It is, absolutely. So what can people find on your website, and where is your website, and where can people get your book?
Right. What's the easiest way? I've got absolutely loads of links all over the web. I'm on Twitter, so you can find me on Twitter at Roz_Morris. Morris, and the Roz is ROZ. And do put the underlined in, because there's another Roz Morris who gets tweets to me all the time, and she hardly ever tweets herself, so she must sort of be having quite a weird experience. I'm also on Facebook. You can find me on my blog, which is Nail Your Novel, and that'll lead you to all the other places.
And the book is out?
The book is out on the 2nd of October, but you can pre-order it before then. And it's available in the ebook formats and a lovely paperback.
Fantastic. Oh, and are you considering reading it for an audio version? Because you have a lovely voice.
Oh, thank you. I am considering it. I have to brush up on my audio production skills, because I did do some audio production on my course, my ghostwriting course, and I've now forgotten everything. So...
That's what studios are for.
Yes, well, that's another possibility.
Yeah, but I think it would definitely work as an audiobook as well with your voice. I think that would be really lovely. So the book is Not Quite Lost, Travels Without a Sense of Direction. And thanks so much for your time, Roz. That was great.
And thank you for having me. It's great to be back.